such a pleasure to welcome all of you this evening to both a book launch and a roundtable on a really outstanding book, which was published last year by the University of Notre Dame Press in the United States, The Wisdom of Our Ancestors, Conservative Humanism and the Western Tradition, which was co-authored by a friend and former colleague of mine, Professor McAleer at Loyola University, Maryland, and by Dr. Alexander Rosenthal-Pubul, who is with us here this evening, who's also a friend and former colleague of Graham's in Baltimore. So Dr. Rosenthal-Pubul is going to be addressing us in just a minute, so I'll introduce both him and our conversation partner. Dr. Rosenthal is the co-founder and director of the Petrarch Institute. He holds a BA from Princeton University and a PhD from my alma mater, actually, the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium. And he's taught at both Johns Hopkins, Loyola University, Maryland, and also the Dominican House of Studies. So all of those are in kind of Baltimore and Washington, D.C. And before The Wisdom of Our Ancestors, he authored a book in 2008 titled Crown Under Law, Richard Hooker, John Locke, and the Ascent of Modern Constitutionalism, which might be of interest to some of you. And so after he gives his opening remarks, we're going to hear a reply from Professor Daniel Mahoney, who is Professor Emeritus at Assumption University, Senior Fellow at the Claremont Institute, and former visiting fellow just last year here at the Danube, a friend of the house, to be sure. I'll just mention two of his many books. In 2022, his book Recovering Politics, Civilization, and the Soul came out with St. Augustine's Press. And then he has a book coming out at the end of this year or early next titled The Persistence of the Ideological Lie, which is a very gripping and intriguing title. But I would first like to hear from Alexander regarding this really outstanding book, which I commend to you all. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, David, for an excellent introduction. And I'm very honored to be here at the Danube Institute and in Hungary, a country for which I have warm feelings. And I also wanted to extend my sorrow for the fact that Graham was not able to be here, unfortunately. So that leaves me to represent the book. So at all events, I think the way I'm going to structure this is first I'm going to give some sense of the why, some sense of the impetus for why we wrote this book. And then I'm going to discuss four what I think are critical themes. So we talk about conservative humanism, and maybe one of the first things you'll be thinking about is what exactly does that mean? What is conservative humanism? So I'm going to first discuss what is conservatism as we understand it in the book. And among other things, I think the recent EU elections indicate that conservatism is still a very relevant political philosophy in the contemporary era. Secondly, what is humanism? What do we mean by humanism? What is its importance in the trajectory of Western civilization generally? Because it's a very obviously central theme to our book. A third theme is the theme we could call cosmopolitanism and nationalism, and where does conservatism fit in that particular debate? So if you were looking at the time when Roger Scruton first wrote his text, The Meaning of Conservatism, at that time I would say conservatism had tended to cash out as a combination of classical liberalism, belief in individual rights and freedoms and free markets, combined with a certain element of social traditionalism and anti-communism. But what has tended, I think, to happen is there's on some parts of the right an increased questioning of liberalism, and so there's tended to be a schism between, we could say, liberal and nationalist forms of conservatism. So one of the things that we want to look at is where exactly does conservatism fit in the cosmopolitan, liberal, nationalist, particularist debate? And lastly, about the meaning of freedom, which seems everybody talks about freedom, everybody wants to be free, but what does it mean? And is there a specifically conservative conception of freedom which differs in particulars from, for example, a liberal conception? But let me first begin by talking about why we wrote the book. In part, in a certain sense, the book was a homage to perhaps the greatest traditionalist conservative figure of recent times, Sir Roger Scruton, who will be well known to many in Hungary. So he dies in 2020, and so like I said, when he wrote The Meaning of Conservatism, it was a certain historical context. We, in the 21st, now well into the 21st century, are looking toward a new historical context. So that's, we wanted to revisit that question. What is the meaning of conservatism in our time? A second issue that arose in 2020, which seems to have been a very big year in many respects, of course you all remember the COVID restrictions and so forth, was there were, in the United States particularly, but to some degree in Europe as well, there were sort of waves of iconoclasm, which Dan has written very eloquently about, attacks on the historical figures and heroes of Western culture. So to give an example of just symbolic, you had vandalisms of figures like Columbus, of Churchill, of the American founding fathers, of Spanish missionaries, this sort of attack. And this fits in actually with an important theme which Scruton warned about frequently, which is this idea of the culture of repudiation, the tendency among Westerners to repudiate their own past, right? And to sort of treat it as a burden of sin to be cast off. I'll just, there was a debate at Stanford University in recent years, and one student wrote, against a Western civilization requirement, a Western civ requirement would necessitate that our education be centered on upholding white supremacy, capitalism, colonialism, and all other oppressive systems that flow from Western civilizations. So needless to say, we found this account, which is quite widespread, this view of the West as fundamentally wicked, as reductionist, to say the least. So we wanted to revisit the wisdom of our ancestors, which is a phrase that comes from Edmund Burke. Now, a fourth element is that I think there is, in fact, confusion over what is the proper meaning of a conservative identity in the 21st century. And we see this, for example, in the splits between so-called freedom conservatives, who more or less come close to identifying conservatism with the liberal project, and on the other hand, national conservatives, who in some cases tend to identify conservatism with the national project. Now, both of these forces, both of these Western ideas, we could say, liberalism and nationalism, are very important. They contain ideas that conservatives should reckon with. In some cases, in many cases, there can be fruitful hybrid forms like liberal conservatism, nationalist conservatism with patriotic values and so forth. But we wanted to look at, is there a specific conservative identity which is not reducible either to the liberal political philosophy or to a nationalist political philosophy. So with that, I'll now turn to the first of my four themes, which is what is conservatism, right? I think we can say that conservatism is very basically the defense of ancestral traditions, right? And this is certainly something which was affirmed by Burke, but I think you can find this tendency to look upon the ancestral as a source of wisdom, the accumulated wisdom of the past, as a source of wisdom for the present. and as a precious patrimony which should be passed on, preserved with respect, and passed on like a patrimony generation after generation. And we find this cross-culturally, attitudes which are quite consonant with conservatism, right? I mean, think of Confucius talking about the ancestral traditions of China, the mos maiorum of the Romans, the ancestral customs of the Romans. So this is sort of I would say conservatism in this sense is the default attitude of all cultures everywhere. Why we talk about political conservatism, why we begin to become self-conscious of conservatism is because in the modern age, and I would say beginning above all with the French Revolution, there was a crisis, right, where during the French Revolution they sought to basically cast off the entirety of the past, all the fundamental institutions, the church, and the political institutions of France, and literally begin from year one. And now we talk more about year zero. This is a revolutionary impulse. And in modernity, you have a new conception of time and history in which the future is viewed as good and the past is somehow viewed as bad. Obviously, I'm simplifying, but there's more or less this idea in the air. And so conservatism developed as a self-conscious effort to conserve, right? To conserve the past against those political tendencies which are destructive of it. So in some sense, conservatism is a philosophy of crisis, right? It acknowledges that there is a problem, right? There has to be an opposition. Now, so what does this mean practically? What are the institutions in a culture which conservatives want to conserve? Well, quite logically, those which are most important for the conservation of a culture or a civilization through time. And we talked about a trinity of institutions which are central to the transmission of cultural values. Okay, so the first of these would be religion, right? Christopher Dawson talked about the world religions as being the keystone of the world cultures, right? So if you look at any world civilization, whether it's Hinduism in the context of India or Islam in the context of the Middle East, the Confucian and Taoist traditions in China, we see that they have kind of an all-embracing influence on all aspects of culture, from art to morality to law to education and so forth. And for Europe and the West, we can consider the West more or less Europe and Europe abroad in some sense. Christianity has obviously played a very central role in the history of Western civilization. The second important institution is the family, right? And so, for example, T.S. Eliot speaks of the fact that he says that the primary channel of transmission of culture is the family, and obviously the family, even in the most biological sense, is the institution. Marriage and the family is the institution by which physically societies conserve themselves. And you will notice that conservatives of today have very great concerns about the fate of the family, about the demographic crisis, about the impacts of new ideas about gender and sexuality, which challenge traditional norms that are related to this idea of procreation and rearing of children, rearing a new generation, and the stability of the marriage bond as being fundamental to that. And the third institution that or element in the conservation of any civilization is a system of education. So Christopher Dawson again wrote that a common educational tradition creates a common world of thought with common moral and intellectual values and a common inheritance of knowledge. And these are the conditions which make a culture conscious of its identity. He goes on to say any break in the continuity of an educational tradition involves a corresponding break in the continuity of the culture, right? So that if a culture were to lose its educational tradition, it would lose its identity as a civilization. So the question I would raise is, does the West have an educational tradition, right, that unites it as the West? Of course, there are national traditions. There's the American tradition, the Hungarian tradition, the French tradition. Is there a Western as a civilization, transcending national borders, and I think it clearly does, which is the classical tradition of Greek and Roman letters, the tradition of humane letters, which more or less continuously from, as Dawson notes, right, from the sophists of antiquity, through the Roman grammarians, through the monks of the Middle Ages, through the universities of the Middle Ages, to the modern universities and private schools and so forth, up until the 20th century, an education in Greek and Latin letters was the foundation of higher education, right? And I would say also a fertile source of Western achievement through time. And of course, education is one of the obvious methods by which culturally you transmit the essence of your culture to a new generation. So education is another important issue for conservatives. Now, I'll say a fourth thing about these three institutions, these three organs of tradition, as we call them. You'll notice that they're all, in some sense, communal, right? Which I think, so religion, the family, education, private schools, and these sorts of institutions, they're all intermediary institutions between the state and the individual. And this is important because it distinguishes conservatism, I think, from liberal individualism on the one hand, which focuses all on the individual, and things like socialism, fascism, communism, which all focus on the state. Conservatism is interested in community, it's interested in communal institutions, but as particularly those which are in between, which are neither state nor simply the atomized individual. Okay, so everything, for the most part, most of what I've said about conservatism, we could apply to any culture and civilization, I think, right? We can talk about the religion, the familial institutions, and the educational institutions of any cultural tradition, anywhere. So one of the things I want to, we wanted to look at was what would be something kind of specific to the West about the Western tradition that is kind of distinguishing. You know, if you read, for example, Fukuyama's work, it's liberalism, right? But we kind of had a problem with that because liberalism, usually John Locke is called the father of liberalism. Liberalism is obviously a very important political philosophy, but John Locke is 17th century. So what do we do with all the rest of the Greek, Roman, medieval, Renaissance periods of European history? What do we do with all of that? That type of progressivist history, what it tends to do is see them all as either false paths or prefigurations, like what did they contribute? And it's a very teleological view of history. We decide, what we see as sort of the master idea of Western civilization is this idea of humanism. And I would want to explain what we mean by humanism. Humanism is sometimes used today as a synonym for secularism, which it certainly is not. One of the advantages of thinking about the West in terms of the humanist tradition is that it allows us to look, there are forms of humanism distinctive to the different major epochs of the West. There's a classical humanism, there's a Christian humanism, and there are modern forms of humanism. So the concept of humanism that we're talking about, I mean, you can think about the humanista of the Renaissance, but the concept goes back, the term in some sense is derived from the Roman humanitas, right? And Aulus Gellius in the 2nd century in his work Noctes Atticae referred to, what's the definition of humanitas? Humanitas, right? Humanity. He referred to it as erudition and formation in the noble or the liberal arts, eruditionem institutionemque bonas artes. And so basically what he's thinking about is education not as a technical preparation for a job, right? Learning the skills to be good at software, or we might say today, or economic marketing and those kinds of technical sorts of skills, but educating what is particular to man, what is particular to the human being, What is particular to the human being are the intellectual and moral faculties. And this was really the focus of Greek and Roman education. As Aulus Gellius says, it comes from the Greek paideia, and you'll see this concept over and over again in figures like Plato and Isocrates and so forth. This idea of paideia is the cultivation of human excellence, of arete, across the whole range of human powers, intellectual, moral, aesthetic, even physical. And it consisted of things that were considered proper to the free citizen: rhetoric, poetry, philosophy, and so forth. Now, this is obviously a very formative and important tradition of humanism that was conserved, right? I mean, we saw it in the Renaissance. We saw, well, it never died away completely. But there is an issue with it, which is not everyone has, for example, the leisure to focus on those arts which were considered in the classical world to have their own proper excellence. And here is one of the many areas where I think Christian humanism adds something very important and central to the Western humanist project, which is the idea of the dignity of every human being, right, as something accorded by God. So we would say it comes, there's an important element that comes originally from Old Testament Judaism, right, with the idea of being created in God's image. Every human being is created in the image of God. Think about you think about Christianity, it's one of the most anthropological religions, right? With its idea of God becoming man, right? Think about the cross, right? Which I would say reveals something twofold in the Christian attitude toward humanity, which is, on the one hand, the sin, the cruelty, the brokenness of the human condition, right? And we could call that a kind of limitation, qualification in some sense of just glorifying humanity. But on the other hand, think also of the idea of what it means in terms of what we are worth to God, right? Effectively what the cross is saying is that every human being is of infinite worth. Every human being is worth the body and blood of Jesus Christ, right? And it's from here that we find the development of human rights, which have played such an important role in the history of the West. And then we have modern humanism, which is very complex, and obviously I can't summarize here in some short opening remarks. One aspect certainly is the idea in Bacon and Descartes of becoming masters of the natural world through the cultivation of the sciences, right? And even a kind of placing man at the center. On the other hand, you have the emergence in modernity. We also have, we should say, of liberalism, right, with its conception of the human being and the rights and freedoms of every human being, and the effort to create political forms which respect those rights and those freedoms. We also have, during modernity, the emergence of a secular form of humanism, right? So Baron de Holbach, in his work, The Good Sense, said, the human mind, confused with its theological opinions for God itself, doubted its own powers, right? So we have this idea of God and religion as being a kind of obstacle to human development. This idea you can see developed, for example, in Cardinal de Lubach's book on the drama of atheistic humanism. Now here's the thing that I think is kind of fundamental here, is that as Nicholas Berdyaev, who is a very significant Russian exile, religious existentialist, wrote, the effort to actually displace God, which is one current in modernity. We certainly are not, blindly anti-modern, right? But there's one current in modernity which tends to undermine itself, trying to affirm human dignity by displacing God, right? But as Berdyaev notes, this actually lowers the human being, right? Because that means that the human being no longer has a spiritual transcendent side, right, that comes from God. We're just random atoms and quarks and cells that somehow randomly came together for no particular reason. And there's no particular reason in that kind of worldview to affirm the special dignity and transcendent value of the human being, right? Which is one of the things I believe the West has to defend. To give a contemporary example, Yuval Harari kind of has something of this worldview, and he says human rights don't exist, freedom does not exist, the soul does not exist, right? So if this is a worldview which is meant to place man at the center, right, what it actually does because of its materialism is undermine human dignity. You have, the examples of 20th century totalitarianism, all of which exalted, as Berdyaev noted, material forces, communism, which Hungary certainly knows all too intimately, glorified economics, Nazism, glorified race, right? These sorts of things. So this is something to keep in mind, and I don't think those dangers are over. I'll just say a couple of very brief things about the last two topics. Cosmopolitanism and nationalism, right? What is the conservative view of cosmopolitan and nationalism? So on the one hand, which seems to be like a big debate going on right now, a lot of the force, on the one hand, there are sort of cosmopolitan forces which see no value in the nation and national sovereignty, in particularistic loyalties to one's own people and heritage, and more or less want to eliminate them in order to create this sort of universal humanity, right? And on the other hand, you have nationalists of different kinds. Now, of course, the danger is in the extreme form of nationalism, you can get xenophobia and those kinds of excesses. So I think the conservative position on this is closely related to, well, St. Thomas Aquinas talked about an ordo caritatis, right? It's perfectly normal, for example, that people would love their own family more than other people's families, right? It's a normal sentiment, I think, a very normal sentiment to love your own country, right? And to feel privileged loyalties to your own country and your own community, to feel at home in your own culture. At the same time, there is sort of a concentric circle, so we don't exclude the outsider, right? This is what Jesus was talking about with the Good Samaritan, right? Who's a foreigner who turns out to be the true neighbor, right? So what you, I think, want to always be careful about is that not to make the nation or the ethnos sort of the final end, right? And so these universalistic values of the West, which come from Christianity, which come from the natural law tradition, to give you another one which you can find in the Stoics and Cicero and so forth, would be another important element. And finally, I want to mention something about liberty, right? So obviously, liberty is the fundamental value of liberalism, and I believe it's a genuine achievement of liberalism to limit the power of the state where it does this successfully, so that it doesn't trample over what are sometimes called negative liberties. Your ability to speak freely, to think freely, to practice the religion you wish to practice, right, that accords with your conscience and so forth. I think these are all positive elements of the Enlightenment tradition. But at the same time, I think there's also value to thinking about the classical and Christian understanding of liberties. Socrates, Xenophon's Socrates in the Memorabilia, asks, do you think that man is free who is ruled by bodily pleasures and is unable to do what is best because of them? The passions are also enslaving, right? The passions in the classical understanding, and I think this accords with the Christian understanding for the most part, can also enslave. I'll give you an example. Take, for example, the alcoholic. Is the alcoholic free when he can buy alcohol whenever he wishes? Or is he free when he's actually free from the need, right, that he cannot control? And so we have to ask, free for what, right? What is the end of human freedom? And ultimately, freedom for virtue, freedom for excellence. These are the kinds of things that conservatives have always looked to, right? Burke famously said, let me know what people desire before I can affirm it, right? Freedom without virtue and wisdom is not an inherent positive, the mere fact that you can do certain things. So that's another thought. A last idea I want to leave with you, because another important figure in our excursus was Pope Benedict. Unfortunately, Roger Scruton passed away at the beginning of our project, and Benedict passed away at the end. And in a certain way, the last part of her book is in a certain way a kind of homage, because, you look at something like the Regensburg Address, he emphasizes, Europe, don't forget your roots in this great historical encounter between Greek philosophy and biblical faith. These are really the foundations of what can be called Europe, together with the Roman tradition. And it's sort of that grand synthesis that I think our book tries to celebrate as the wisdom of our ancestors. So thank you very much.
Thanks so much for that great introduction to the grand synthesis. And I've already said, but I want to say again, the book really is a beautiful introduction to that grand synthesis, with chapters on law and enterprise and literature and philosophy. But please, Professor Mahoney, give your reply.
This is not a point-counterpoint. I wrote the foreword to the book. Precisely for the same reason. I think it's the book, The Wisdom of Our Ancestors, provides a impressive and incisive and utterly reliable guide to the humane conservative currents that constitute Western civilization at its best. And let me start with, if I had of course, when we talk about conservatism, I think all of us have in mind that conservatism has some relationship to liberalism. But of course, liberalism is decayed and decaying, but there was a high tradition of liberalism. That's why so many of the thinkers I most admire in the 19th and 20th century, scholars debate, were they liberal conservatives or conservative liberals, or, there's a liberal moment in all conservative thought. And I thought I would begin by just quoting a line of self-definition by Edmund Burke at the beginning of the Reflections on the Revolution in France, where he's addressing the question, should he be enthusiastic about the outbreak of the French Revolution? By the way, if you look at Burke's correspondence to his son Richard, he was open to it for about a month until its deepest tendencies became most apparent. But he compared the liberty unleashed by the French Revolution to a wild gas, that could go in any direction and sort of burn everything down. And he said, well, I first have to know what liberty is related to. But in contradistinction to this anarchistic and antinomian understanding of liberty, Burke associated with the dominant elements of the revolution, he said, I stand for a manly, moral, and regulated liberty. All right. Manly's not very high in the hierarchy of goods in the Western Academy today. Manliness is a virtue that is confused with misanthropy and misogyny and settler colonialism. Every 13-year-old in the United States talks about settler colonialism. All around the world there were pacifistic, ecologically minded native peoples who never fought with anyone, like the Aztecs in Mexico, with their 20,000 human bodies sacrificed to the gods every year. And then, the Westerners came in, and for the first time in human history, assaulted these primordial, naive, like the innocence described by Rousseau in the Second Discourse, the you might say, the prehistorical beings who just picked berries and somehow copulated by accident in the woods. Well, this is this is the kind of language we hear in the American Academy today when the activist and intellectual class. And I think today it's really imperative, as this book does so impressively, to make a case for a manly, moral, and regulated liberty. But that manly, moral, and regulated liberty can't simply be a project that begins with the here and now. It has to draw on the wisdom of the ancestors. But one thing I would like to make very clear, this book in no way suggests that the true and the ancestral and the good are always and everywhere the same. The kind of argument that Aristotle makes it in his Politics when he's talking about the first rationalistic social scientist, Hippodamus, want to get rid of all tradition, remake the law, and everything would be new. And Aristotle says, well, you know, people pay attention to what's been, and they learn from it, and you can't just start over all the time. And so Aristotle, in a way, was the first critic of people who confused political reason with geometric rationalism. And everything in Hippodamus's ideal city was based on the number 3. You know, it's like the French revolutionaries got rid of the provinces of France. We still call them Burgundy and Languedoc and all that, but it's really, they were geometric substitutes, these départements with the subdivisions of arrondissement and all this, the spirit of rationalism at work. So Burke and Aristotle were never a certain deference to received opinion, to that which is wise and prudent and true, is not the same thing as an uncritical deference to everything that's been. And I think that's very, very important. The default position of a philosophically minded conservative is based on respect for the ancestors. It is not there's a movement today called traditionalism with a capital T. Theorists like Guénon, the Frenchman and all this, who they speak about these, and Dugin in Russia draws on this, they draw on these completely closed communities. And in there, Spengler belongs to this tradition, maybe a higher version of it, but there are just these separate sort of flowers or separate kinds of traditions. There's no universal articulation of the good. Now, I would say the other kind of traditionalism, the kind defended by Burke and somebody like Roger Scruton in our time, does not defend the tradition against the universal, and it doesn't identify what exists with the good, but it has, as I say, it has due respect for the wisdom and that's cluttered amidst, you might say, received traditions. And I would add to this a kind of moral stand that accompanies the conservative and maybe the high liberal stance, and that is a deep and abiding sense of gratitude. The culture of repudiation, to use Roger Scruton's wonderfully evocative phrase, and by the way, it's all around us, particularly in the Western world, to negate, to repudiate, to identify the great and the good with oppression and domination. You know, power is the alpha and the omega. The idea that there could be, I would say, the distinctive marks of anything that's nihilistic, that belongs to the camp of repudiation and negation today, is the utter unwillingness to make any distinction between legitimate authority and authoritarianism. Authority is, by definition, authoritarian. But I think the spirit of indebtedness, Bertrand de Jouvenel, a French liberal conservative thinker, one of the most gracious writers of the 20th century, he liked to say that the wise man knows himself for debtor. He knows himself as fundamentally indebted, not only the gift of civilization, the gift of family, the gift of creation, the gift of the soul, but And he said, when Mill says, well, you can do anything you want as long as it doesn't affect others. And Juvenal asked John Stuart Mill, what do any of us do and think that doesn't affect others? This idea of some understanding of the human person where we are these mini gods who can go about remaking the world and basing everything on our ego, that is not a viable or plausible or compelling account of human personhood. A couple of remarks about the attitude toward progress. This is a theme that's picked up in this book, Wisdom of the Ancestors. I think the true conservative has to recognize a place for progress, certainly material and technical progress, as absolutely essential. Among other things, if one believes, I think as Christians do, or as decent humanists do, that we have to eliminate or extreme poverty or destitution or misery, you're not going to do that without economic growth. You're not going to do that with certain elements of social modernization. On the other hand, progress with a capital P, where we replace the primordial and noble and enduring distinction between good and evil with the distinction between progress and reaction. And that distinction is very alive in the Western world today. It's different than the Bolshevik distinction or the Jacobin distinction between progress and reaction, but it has the same internal ideological structure. Once you're relegated to the camp of reaction, you are getting in the way of the progress of the human race. And that means, totalitarian means can be justified to, what did Lenin say and how to organize the competition? January 10th, 1918, we must purge all the harmful insects from the Russian land. The harmful insects were the independent peasants, the religious believers, the merchants, the democratic socialists, the czarists, members of the old regime. Well, basically anyone who wasn't a member of the Bolshevik Party. So I think, as Simone Weil, the French philosopher, died at a very young age, 34 in 1943, but she wrote at the end of her life in some philosophical notebooks, progress in the ideological sense is a lie. The drama of good and evil in the human soul never goes away. There are no solutions to the human problem or the human condition. Burke in The Reflection speaks about the inventiveness of wickedness. If only we can get rid of the communists, if only we could get rid of the Jacobins, we'll go back to normal. No, wickedness will, reinvent itself, and the struggle for the sustenance of civilization continues. Let me quote a Hungarian-born thinker, Michael Polanyi. We call him Michael Polanyi, one of the Polanyi brothers, but he was a chemist and scientist who became I think an important philosophical figure in the Western world, conservative-minded in that he thought that scientism was a threat to human dignity. He was a great anti-totalitarian. But he wrote near the end of his life that the kinds of goods that we associate with Tom Paine was the American revolutionary, made the mistake to going to revolutionary France, got arrested by the Jacobins after he pleaded for clemency for the royal family. But he had more radical views, I think, than the typical American founders. Teddy Roosevelt called him a dirty little atheist. But he wanted commercial society. He was a deist, a free thinker, and all that. But Michael Polanyi said the only way you can achieve the goods that somebody like Michael Polanyi wants, moderate progress, commercial civilization, representative government, widespread elections, is on the foundation of traditional continuity provided by his great opponent, Edmund Burke. In other words, liberalism in decisive respects depends on a conservative foundation. And without that conservative foundation, liberalism self-destructs. That's the great contribution that conservatism can make to liberalism. It can articulate the unarticulated and often unrecognized preconditions that the liberal order has always depended upon. And liberalism is pretty good at pursuing the death wish, as Malcolm Muggeridge called it. So, two other comments. Repaganization. Very good theme in this book is the danger of the right today in an increasingly post-Christian world turning toward, you might say, pagan ideology or new neo-paganism, where the totally necessary and truthful philosophical and civic defense of self-government, and that means the nation. We got to stop talking so much about roots and identities and talk about the noble grounds of national self-government. It's not just, roots grow and you leave them behind. But we have to make a philosophical case for the nation as the home of liberty and human dignity and self-government. But, repaganization, I see it with the young right in the United States. People who are, they have these sort of vulgar teenage Nietzschean attitudes that they confuse the Christian inheritance with the soft kind of humanitarian leftism and liberationism you see in so many of the Christian churches today. The Pope's rather in that camp. The Anglican Church has been occupied by that. They see Christianity as weak and ineffectual and soft. And so they want to turn to like a pagan revitalization of the West. Yeah. Well, the American commentator Ross Douthat, a New York Times columnist, a very devout Catholic layman, he said, if you are worried, to the left, he said, about the Christian right, wait till you see the pagan right. Repaganism, it attracts the imagination of the young who are disgusted by the sort of effect, lack of courage and energy on the part of those who should be leading the fight in defense of Western civilization. And a final comment on humanism. I think here, and I wholly endorse the book's defense of Christian humanism, culminating in a very rich articulation of what they call the Benedict thesis. But I would say this, and they make all the appropriate distinctions, but I might add a couple of others. One, went straight to the book, generally relying on Nikolai Berdyaev, but a little bit on the Hungarian figure, Oral Kolnai. Kolnai wrote in 1949 in his great essay, Privilege and Liberty, that the self-deification of man always leads to his self-enslavement. That is the great conservative insight, that when human beings try to make themselves gods, they create an unprecedented kind of totalitarian nightmare. And we also have to be very careful not to allow Christian humanism, and Christian humanism contains a very strong element of all those things Alex talked about, of a classical humanism, of people like Thomas Jefferson, however revolutionary some of their political ideas may have been, studied Xenophon's Memorabilia and Cicero's On Duties with great care. Jefferson also made his own Bible. He took scissors and he cut out all the miracles and the resurrection. It's called the Jefferson Bible. He was a certain kind of American founder. But I think we have to be very careful to show that Christian humanism is not secular humanitarianism. It's not a project just to ameliorate the human condition in this world. And it's not the religion of humanity. And I think one reason why we're witnessing a problem on the right, especially the young right, who are looking for change and new modes of thinking, is they look at the institutional and establishment representations of Christianity today, and they see soft humanitarian impulses at work. They don't see a Christianity that supports a manly, moral, and regulated liberty. They don't see the tough-mindedness of Christian thought and action. And so I think, to begin with, those of us who are dedicated to the defense and the real civilizational presence of the Christian proposition really have to fight this religion of humanity, this sort of turning Christianity just into, It's the view that Mother Teresa was a social worker, that the fundamental Christian task is to fight global warming and to support income redistribution and all of this. And this, I tell you, is not the faith that inspired the martyrs, including the martyrs in East Central Europe in the years, or in Russia after 1917. So anyway, I'll leave on that note sort of a potpourri of thoughts inspired by a rereading of this fine book.
Thanks so much, Professor Mahoney. So if I could ask one question of both of you, which also involves me formulating a brief thought, and then hopefully we'll have time for 2 or 3 questions from the floor. But I mean, if there's kind of a slogan one could take away from this evening, I think ancestral conservatism would be a kind of watchword to take away. But one of the most interesting and valuable parts of the book, in my perspective, which chimes very much with what we just heard from Professor Mahoney, is that you argue for ancestral conservatism without re-primitivism. This is actually the or part of the title of one of the chapters, without re-primitivism. And so I just want to put 2 of your thoughts together and ask how they might be related. On the one hand, you say conservatism is the defense of ancestral tradition, thus, ancestral conservatism. But one of the things I like about the book, and again chimes with what we've just heard, is that you take a very capacious view of who our ancestors are, and you see that as a question. Who are our ancestors? And you try to argue that, early modern liberals, as well as early modern Catholic legists, are ancestors in a very important sense, and that even the Enlightenment is part of our ancestral tradition. So I really think that's very beautiful. And then I want to connect that quote. So on the one hand, conservatism is defense of ancestral tradition, but then you also say conservative humanism is the defense of rational order. And it seems to me, I'm asking both of you, but it seems to me that the second definition kind of makes it possible, this insistence that humanism is the cultivation of reason and that this is the heart of the ancestral tradition. This also means that this is the tool we are called upon to use by the ancestral tradition to constantly raise the question of the good. So you very powerfully argued, actually both of you did, but I very much appreciated your comments on basically the question of freedom is never divorced from the question of the good. And I guess I'm just wondering if the humanism you are advocating, precisely because it is connected to rational order, means that in as much as we are defending the ancestral tradition, we are also always going to be asking the question of the good. And insofar as we abandon it, we'll also find ourselves less and less capable, perhaps, of asking the question of the good.
Yeah, David, I think that's a very insightful question, and I think you hit upon something fundamental that although if you look at for the classical and the Christian and also the Enlightenment traditions, they're all traditions in the sense that they belong to what formed European civilization, and they all make inestimable contributions to the accumulated wisdom of our tradition, and yet all of them have an aspiration in some respects toward the universal, right? I mean, think of Aristotle's concept of the rational man. You're making an appeal to universal reason. Christianity is a universalist religion, right? That teaches the dignity of all human beings of whatever heritage or background or so forth. And the Enlightenment, of course, also had universalistic aspirations about the rights of man and so forth. So this is actually, it may sound ironic, but this is an aspect of our tradition, is the concern for the universal good. And to touch on something that Dan was pointing, I think without in any way condemning particularist loyalties, the danger in sort of what he was talking about, I think a kind of vitalistic, Nietzschean type of embrace of tribalism as the language of the proper trajectory for the right, this is something we wanted to attack, critique, in part because it's not actually faithful to what the Western tradition has been. So I don't know if that addressed to your questions, but.
Absolutely, and before we hear from Professor Mahoney, I mean, this leads me also to ask, because I was very taken with your concluding remarks on how Christian humanism, which I think you'll absolutely agree with, Christian humanism is not the religion of the 19th century religion of man, the kind of sentimental humanitarianism, and I just wonder if perhaps there's some confusion about in late modernity and even in late modern Christianity, that the universal is somehow something easy. Like maybe defending the universal, as you were saying, that's actually a very hard thing to do, and it calls us all to hard things.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, one of the things that Niebuhr faulted modern liberalism for, in terms of Reinhold Niebuhr, the American Protestant theologian, was ignoring the recalcitrance of parochialism, of the lust for power, of all these sorts of factors, tribalism, as factors that are very difficult to eliminate. And liberalism kind of assumed that could be done in a facile way, and what you got was a tremendous resurgence, right, in the 20th century of these sort of ultra nationalist, militarist, even forces. So what's really hard is actually balancing what I think are these two essential impulses of universalism and particularism. I mean, all of us have particular cultures for which we justifiably have affection. We have particular families, particular languages, right? And at the same time, the West in particular, I would say, has also had this belief in universal morality, right? In an ethic which let's say we are not, the Western tradition has not been culturally relativistic, right? In the sense of that morality is just whatever any culture decides it is, right? And both the Christianity and the classical natural law traditions would strongly emphasize that point.
Yeah, let me start with reason. I think it's quite striking if one looks out at the landscape, the intellectual and spiritual landscape of the last two generations. The most cogent, energetic, persistent defense of human reason was coming from two Roman Catholic popes, John Paul II and Fides Oratio, and by Pope Benedict in the Regensburg Address and elsewhere, where they lamented a West that had lost sight of reason as providing fundamental guidance for how human beings ought to live and fundamental guidance for the human encounter with what's above man, the transcendent, the eternal. And Pope Benedict liked to talk about this a self-imposed self-limitation of human reason. It's taken the forms of positivism, of scientism, and even a kind of totalitarianism where reason ceases to be an instrument used at the defense of liberty and human dignity, and instead morphs into something other than itself, something like the culture of repudiation. And there's all sorts of ways of getting back, I think, at a more human and more constructive understanding of reason. One is there has been a revival in the academy and philosophy and political theory of Aristotelian and Ciceronian traditions of practical reason. Habermas has these, trying to get back to reason, but it's this wholly formal, communicative rationality. It's like a bunch of German professors at a faculty meeting, but it's hardly, it's better than the repudiation of reason, but the practical reason, I think, is understood in the Western tradition is it's tied to the cardinal virtues. It's the way that the human being, when acting, chooses, and he doesn't choose arbitrarily. He chooses, it's the capacity to know what the right thing to do in the right moment is. And of course, the cultivation of practical reason depends to some extent on religious education, to some extent on civic education, to some extent on liberal education. But it's one of the great gifts we have, that really, if the postmoderns were right, the modern nihilists were right, the radical positivists were right, and every human choice is as Max Weber said, a demonic choice, you know. We choose our God who may turn out to be the devil. We would be in a bad bind. And daily life would be very difficult. Most of us know when a friend has betrayed us, or when a neighbor has done a heinous thing, or when somebody who has abandoned, you know, moral decency. These are not things we have to have academic seminars about, you know. And I think conscience, not understood as, conscience is so often understood to mean self-rule, self-will, subjective arbitrariness, but conscience is understood as a powerful internal voice or vehicle for actuating, you might say, practical moral judgment, practical reason. We have all these tools, and Eric Voegelin, he didn't like to be called a conservative. He was, well, if you spend all your life fighting totalitarianism, denouncing Marxism, Comteism, Nietzscheanism, etc., and returning to Plato and Christianity, you're going to be called a conservative whether you like it or not. But and Voegelin, who could be, Voegelin's insights, I think, are quite accessible, but his language, he says we had to return to common sense, but he did it in a linguistic structure that's half Greek and half German, and that can get in the way. But Eric Voegelin said, look, the modern world has reduced reason to instrumental reason, like Max Weber had done. And then we can know, we can figure out the means to an end, but we can say nothing reasonable, of course, or choice, but what ends are themselves choice-worthy. And that, if that's true, that's a fundamental assault on humanity as a moral agent, as an ethical being, as a political animal. But Voegelin said, no, there's another mode of reason, and the Greeks call it noesis, intellection. The Latins called it ratio. It's certainly tied, as Cicero would say, as Burke would say, to common sense. I think some of the moral sense thinkers of the 18th century recover this tradition. That common sense gives us pretty much, you know, what we need to evaluate, to live well, to evaluate the world before us. But of course, it needs support. It needs, you need philosophers who explain the reasonableness, you might say, as well as the utility of that. But a richer notion, a more capacious notion of reason, that is, as Pope Benedict would say, open to the things of the Spirit. And I think Alex was pointing towards something very interesting. You know, we were talking at lunch today. Today was sort of a long philosophical seminar, a very friendly and fun one. But we were talking about the self-contradictory character of all these scientific people who tell us, you know, you have these journals now, as Roger Scruton always pointed out, he called it the neurobabble, neuroethics, neuroaesthetics, neuro this, neuro that. And the assumption is that we're not thinking, our brains are thinking. Well, when these guys, like the Churchlands, the self-proclaimed philosophers of eliminative materialism, tell us that they're not thinking, but they've come up with a thought telling us we're not thinking either, we can respond by saying, why are we supposed to listen to your thoughts since you're just, you know, a body where synapses are floating around? And there can never, the newspapers always write, they say, they're going to come up with that comprehensive theory that does away with, you know, human dignity, moral choice, consciousness in the soul. They can't, because every effort to do so is an exercise of the powers of the soul and ratiocination. So we need to do a better job. And the more I think about it is this kind of scientism. When you ask a lot of young people why they give up on a religious faith, I don't mean it has to be, you know, the faith of their fathers exactly, but the quest for God, you might say, a lot of it has to do, well, science has made it obsolete. It has done no such thing. They have succumbed to what Mary Midgley, the English philosopher, called nothing buttery. Nothing buttery is, the mind is just the brain. As Roger Scruton likes to say, when you see Mona Lisa, it's not this beautiful painting exuding beauty, it's all the pigments and the parts, We could understand speech that way. Dan Mahoney isn't making an argument. Logos, human speech about the advantageous and the just, as Aristotle says it. These are just sounds, going, well, they are that, but they're more than that. So we got to get over the nothing buttery, and we've got to realize that almost all the ideological positions, including the later settler colonialism, which every 19-year-old in the United States mouths with a particularly annoying idiocy, we have to realize that almost all these ideological currents are, at best, deeply held and parroted prejudices. So in other words, the fundamental fundaments of civilization, politics, understood in the Aristotelian sense, civilization as something higher than disparate cultures, the soul as the seat of inwardness and agency, they are as untouched as they ever were. We just got to get the news out there.
Well, thank you for those wonderful sounds, Professor Mahoney. So I have one last question, but first I would like to open it to the floor and see if we have some questions from the floor for our panelists.
Don't be shy.
Well, I haven't lived in the U.S. for quite a bit of time. I hear something called transhumanism to justify, among other things, the gender fluidity issue, et cetera. Could you go into that a little bit?
Well, I haven't lived in the U.S. for a long time myself, I have to say.
I live behind the Iron Curtain.
Yeah, so I actually see it as kind of connected to something that we were kind of talking about. So, Yuval Harari is kind of an example of this post-humanism that I think actually he kind of sees as partially a threat and partially an outcome of his logic, which is that, well, if humans are nothing but material entities, then why do they have any particular special value? And maybe they can be manipulated through all kinds of ways using modern digital technologies. So that's one path to transmission. I think there's a lot of concern about genetic engineering, right? We may start to produce entities that are not quite human, chimeras, or there's all kinds of possibilities. There's also what we could call misanthropy, which is quite widespread, the belief that humans, just like there's this idea in the West that the West is the source of all evil, there's also like a broader idea that the human species is the source of all evil, and there's antinatalism and so I would see it as this idea that humanity is a phase which we are somehow transcending, whether via technology or other things, and to the degree that there are cheerleaders for this, I find it very odd. But I think one of the missions, we could say, of conservatism, as we've attempted to articulate it, is in fact the defense of the human being as a fundamental and intrinsic, even transcendent value. So I hope that.
But I must say, once you did away with men and women, God created the male and female, Genesis 1:27. Very hard to defend. The Canadian government, I just read this today, some good news from the Canada's like Belgium, like loony euthanasia.
Except the Belgian Prime Minister just resigned.
He did?
The Canadians could only dream of such an eventuality.
When pretty boy Trudeau resigns, I'm having a party and you're all invited. The Canadian Cancer Society and the Canadian Minister of Health announced that they will no longer have any official documentation with the word vagina, because vagina suggests biologically physical women. And so the Canadian bureaucracy has now announced that in all medical documentation, the term to be used is front hole. I'm sorry if this sounded like a pure pornographic announcement, but it's what's coming from Canadians used to be very mild-mannered people. And before the 60s, the trope was that America was a more Lockean country and Canada was owed more to the empire. It was part of the Commonwealth. The Queen was and there was more of a tradition of deference and less of rights. But Canada, that's all been reversed in recent years. Transhumanism, is it Ray Singleton? Is that his name? Who wrote the book on the singularity? Supposedly,
Kurzweil.
Oh, Ray Kurzweil.
Ray Kurzweil.
Ray Kurzweil wrote a book called The Singularity. Now, he predicted, I think this was less a prediction and more an announcement, that in the year 2039, we will reach the great singularity. The singularity would consist of this ability of, I suppose, socially progressive and technologically astute human beings to download. We don't have souls. There's no imago Dei, but they're going to download something, some of these elements of cognition in the brain and put them on highly developed exemplars of digital technology. I can't even read about it very much because of the self-evident absurdity of it, but my guess is that the human yearning for the immortal or eternal persists even with foolish, uneducated, self-parodic techno enthusiasts, I mean, this is a frontal, if it ever was carried through, would involve a fundamental assault on human beings and human nature. But a lot of people, the rich billionaire technocrats in California, symbolized by the Silicon Valley, they're the ones who respond to this silly spiritualization of technocracy, and they get giddy about it. But as Leon Kass said about similar calls for immortality, if you look at the classical and Christian traditions, what people are looking for in the eternal and immortal is not to be a vampire, not to live forever and ever and ever on this world with all its sorrows. You're looking for wholeness, spiritual, intellectual, etc. And that's going to be experienced through some kind of communion with transcendence. But the idea of living forever in this world would be, I think, a nihilistic nightmare. And no one would go outside. They'd all be afraid of being hit by a bus, if we eliminated diseases. And with the singularity, I think it doesn't take any of us more than 2 or 3 seconds to realize whatever that digital information on their new machines, it's not going to be you. So it's silly and instructive, but a lot of well-educated, rich, foolish people find some kind of deluded spiritual solace in it. Vogelin had a category, he called it psychopathology. It was the political version of psychopathology. And he said some movements you just have to study as a sickness of soul. And I think transhumanism is a sickness of soul.
I'm a couple of degrees separated from one of the Silicon Valley billionaires who is aspiring to immortality, and I saw a photo of him today on social media with one of his feet very conspicuously bandaged. So he has a sprained ankle at the moment, which I think goes to show that he's, however long he might live, he's not found immortality, and he will not find immortality in this realm. Do we have another question? We have time for at least one more question. Let's try to get 2 questions in, starting in the back.
We're talking about humanism and how come humanism evolved in the West. I think in this respect it's important to stress that only in the West they really developed the notion of a personal God. Like if you look at the Chinese tradition, Taoism, there's no real notion of personal God. Even Hinduism, the Brahman is not a personal God. Or in Buddhism, and in the West, they developed the idea, the notion of a personal God, that one is in a relation of love and respect. And this was what facilitated the development of humanism. This came from the Jewish tradition, from the biblical tradition, and with the Greek, which really developed the idea of the individual, of democracy, the polis.
Mhm.
And this later was bequeathed to the West and returned and appeared again in the secular version later after the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And humanism, as I see it, what I think Yuval Harari is talking, it's really coming from the identification of the person totally with his body. And since we're entering an age in which our body is going to be technically changed, he's claiming that we're entering into a transhumanism, to a new era. Mm-hmm. Of course, this is debatable.
Alexander, do you?
Well, I mean, of course, I agree with what you're saying. So I mean, what I was partially trying to discuss was sort of the transition from humanism to an anti-humanism. I would consider the view that human beings are of no particular value and just material entities that just happen to exist through a concordance of random forces to be something which undermines human dignity. And it's certainly true that the biblical tradition, right, so with the Jewish tradition, with the idea of man being created in God's image, and then with the Christian idea of the incarnation, God becoming man, God suffering for every human being, right? I mean, in the Christian standard Catholic belief, God would offer himself on the cross for every human being who's ever lived. That means the human being has an infinite value, right? So between these two things, and then the classical tradition is interesting in this respect because it thought of a kind of human dignity, but one which had to be developed, right? So humanitas is sort of the full development of the human through this process of education, but clearly they celebrated human powers of reason and moral faculties and aesthetics. So the West, I think, is very fortunate to have these twin pillars, right? Of, we could say, Athens and Jerusalem, or Athens, Jerusalem, and Rome. And unfortunately, as Roger Scruton talked about, this culture of repudiation, very strangely, rather than embrace these riches, the wisdom of our ancestors, there's this tendency to toss them out as sort of, foolish people who lived in a pre-technological era. So,
yeah, just one sentence, really. The Greeks, there's so much spiritualism with the Greeks, but the Platonic good is impersonal, and thought thinking itself is impersonal, and as you say, I would also say the biblical world says God created the world good. It's not this suffering realm that we need to escape from. So the kind of realism of a world that is essentially good, even if corrupted by sin, is very, very different than a desire. Nirvana is the desire to escape from reality, from suffering. And those are two vastly different understandings of the spiritual tasks of human beings.
Yes, one question about wisdom. The first lines of the Iliad, written 2,900 years ago, goes like this: "Sing, goddess of the anger of Achilles, accursed, which brought countless pains upon the Greek, hurled to Hades many strong souls of heroes." So it means that 2,900 years ago, our fellow Europeans were already aware of human insanity, fury. You know? Now, if you continue, take Seneca. If you are aware of of his ideas, you have no problem in your life any longer. However, look at the end he had. You know? Christianity. You claim there is a Christianity as an entire block. I don't see it like this. Take Maximus the Confessor. His end. His end. Ripped off the tongue and so on. Very cruel. So it appears, and this is my question, what do you do with all this wisdom which we had, especially from the antiquity to the Christianity and so on and so on. But we had then, we ended up with World War II, and 20 years later we had World War II. Now we have a war against Russia. Look at these tortured bodies, which you can see in the internet and so on. So what you do with the wisdom, what is it good for? Yeah, do you have a solution how to maybe to reintroduce wisdom more than high-tech missile rubbish? Yeah, that's my question. Yeah.
Well, I certainly can't claim here to have the solution to the human problem of peace and all that in any kind of simple way. But I mean, you're certainly right, and maybe this is something. That's why there's a point in the book where we talk about the tempering aspect of Augustine, right? Because Augustine sees the fallenness also and the brokenness of the human condition, our lust for power, our tendency to sin, that history has vindicated. But I believe that this can actually be mobilized in a conservative sense because as against like sort of a facade progressivist idea that humans are just going to get better and better, history seems to demonstrate, as you yourself are explaining, that violence, that cruelty, the lust for power, greed, sensuality, all of these are perennial problems. And the best, I would argue, obviously these are complex issues, but the best resources that we have to deal with them are the accumulated wisdom of the centuries, right? If we want to understand what a human being is, right? Classical literature, the Bible, right? All of these things are highly instructive and educational. But I certainly can't claim that I have the solution to all the wars and conflicts and the potential. In fact, what I think I'm trying to do, we are trying to do in part, is we see the West as kind of in a crossroads. I see the West as kind of in a crossroads, and there are many ways we can go, good and bad, and I'm hoping to make it, that we've made some contribution toward what the good might look like.
One thing I'll say is, I think one of the most sophisticated arguments against pursuing wisdom is the argument from sociological pluralism. All my colleagues will say, well, we're just too much of a pluralistic society in order to continue to pursue the good, or to have conversations about the truth. And, in other words, so the sheer fact of plurality, of a certain kind of diversity of belief or practice or ethnicity, means the question of the good life, the true, the good, and the beautiful, is closed off. No, it's all the more reason to pursue these questions. But all these great traditions, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, The Abolition of Man, when it comes to how human beings ought to live day to day, there's much more common agreement than not. And so you could still make a very good argument, philosophically astute, historically grounded argument that, short of those sectors of the population who have been ideologically corrupted by deep relativism, there's something like a moral consensus among humankind. You can't find a culture where people say betrayal is a good thing and not being loyal to your parents is a good thing, or murder is a welcome opportunity. You know, something like the Decalogue, some large parts of the Decalogue are part and parcel of how human beings understand the moral dimension of human life. So I just say, you know, this idea, maybe we ought to talk less about cultures. There's a good, elevated, conservative way of talking about cultures. High culture, the continuity of the wisdom of the ancestors, the continuity of cultural practices and wisdom, but there's something above cultures, you know, and we need to return a little bit to what I would call the unitary view of civilization. You know, that a kind of peak of spiritual understanding that is, in principle, I think, present in all cultural life. And let's get rid of drug culture, rock culture, sadomasochistic culture, that kind of use of the word culture, any activity you engage in, however monstrously or immorally, is a culture. No. So, you know, we need to rethink, we need a new nomenclature, and we need to purify these categories of dross.
We have time for one last question, but if I may, or maybe two, but if I may, it occurs to me to at least say, it was a brilliant question and two wonderful replies, but I mean, one could at least ask whether all of the Europeans who were making the decisions in 1914, all of whom had read Thucydides, but if they had perhaps reflected a bit more deeply on the millennial effects of civil war on both Athens and Sparta, basically resulting in their total disappearance from geopolitical history to this day, then perhaps we might have been spared some of the awful depredations we suffered and still live the effects of.
Thank you very much. My question is partly related to these previous remarks, as it is about whether do you think it is possible to bring back this classical tradition of Greek and Roman authors into education in a democratic society, because at least from the example of Hungarian education, the history of Hungarian education, Greek has already started to disappear from the curriculum in the second half of the 19th century, and Latin has disappeared in the second half of the 20th century as higher education became more and more democratic, as more and more people became involved in that. So do you think it is possible to bring back these fairly difficult and possibly elitist elements of human tradition?
Well, I mean, first of all, I mean, of course, you're absolutely right that classical education, which had been sort of the foundational aspect of Western education since, like I said, since really the 5th century BC in Athens in one form or another, tended in the course of the 20th century to disappear. Or at least to become much more, classics became much more of a specialized academic subject rather than the sort of foundational common currency of Western cultural education. There's a number of reasons for it. Part of it may relate to sort of a kind of economism and technologism, that the purpose of education is to prepare you for a career. Now, we're not against the advancements of modern economics and so forth, but at the same time, we don't think it necessarily needs to come at the expense of some of the higher values of human excellence that the classics endowed. If you look at the history of Western achievement, even from the Renaissance figures, but you could think even of one of the last great movements in the sciences in the 19th and 20th century of German physicists. Most of them had classical educations, and Heisenberg talked about the study of Greek philosophy as being indispensable. Now, I think your question is more, can it be brought back? We have the example of a long period in the history of the West where Greek virtually disappeared from the Latin West. And was brought back in the 15th century in a big way. So I'm not a historical determinist. Part of what I'm hoping the book will do is create something of a spur about the value of maintaining these traditions, both because they're part of the Western cultural inheritance. We talk about Europe all the time. what are the things that have made Europe? They're precisely these traditions of common culture. These are really what unite, Italians, Hungarians, Spaniards, and so forth. So I think that it's vital that efforts be made. So I'm not a historical determinist. There are, I know, certain efforts to revive classical studies, and I hope in one form or another, obviously, I'm hoping for a rejuvenation of these traditions.
Tocqueville has a discussion in Democracy in America about the need for a small group of people in a democracy to be deeply formed by the Latin and Greek languages and classics. And his argument is precisely because democracy moves toward mass society, we need countervailing tendencies. People forget Aristotle in his Politics, when he defines education relative to the regime. In the American context, the philosopher John Dewey, mastermind of modern progressive education, famously said, well, the task of democracy is to make democracy more democratic. Well, Aristotle said the task of a good, well-balanced democratic regime is to keep it from becoming too democratic. So to introduce elements within the political order without, in a way, shifting the fundamental political basis of power from the people, but having countervailing tendencies. I think that's what we desperately need. We don't need more 20-year-olds taking their bearings from rap music. We don't need the head of the Folger Library in Washington, D.C., billions of dollars left to encourage Shakespearean education by a wealthy man who loved Shakespeare. And the new appointment as the head of the Folger Library is a woman who wants to not make a big deal about Shakespeare and expose him in the colonialness of his time. So here is a cultural institution that could do immense good by encouraging popular appreciation of Shakespeare. And now we've got a culture commissar who wants Soviet-style re-education to let people know Shakespeare is one of the bad guys. So there's a lot of things we can do. There are some hopeful signs in America. I don't normally come bearing hopeful developments, but I'll tell you a few of them. Homeschooling. A lot of homeschooling networks are quite sophisticated, and homeschooling arrangements are much more likely to read classical literature, classical texts. There's all sorts of private classical schools in the United States where kids are introduced to Latin and to classical text and to important religious texts in elementary school, the great heart schools in the American Southwest. And now we even have in 13 states what we call red. That's another subject, why conservative states are the red states in America. I wrote an article about this. Why? Red for 200 years has been the color of revolutionary nihilism. But never mind. The red and purple states, there are new undergraduate and graduate institutes that have been set up by various state governments to actually have institutes where there is a serious, sympathetic study of Western civilization and the sources of the American civic tradition. And there's not a few of them now. So if there's hope, it's going to be that the highly ideologized currents in higher and lower education. Whenever I speak to groups, I say it starts in kindergarten. The big political debate in Florida was the international press presented it like, the governor of Florida was trying to attack trans children, but it forbid the introduction of trans ideology and alternative pronouns in kindergarten through third grade. A very radical program, don't you think? And so maybe our hope is that the culture of repudiation has become so extremist, so self-parodic, so ridiculous that there's a reopening for common sense.
We have one final, I'm afraid, question from the floor.
Hi, thank you all. So as a younger American, a problem that sort of preoccupies my mind is this trend towards like social atomization, social disintegration in the United States in particular. I think we're further along maybe than Europe in many respects, but the same trend is sort of taking hold here, right? We could maybe speak more specifically of like the decline of the extended family and civil society. In that respect, maybe, I'm thinking of like the Robert Putnam book from the 1990s, Bowling Alone, these sorts of civic institutions are disappearing. It occurs to me that this poses a particular problem to conservatives to the extent that, sort of intergenerational contact is important as a medium of transmitting reverence for tradition, reverence for our culture, and so on and so forth. So my question for you all, and maybe to speak to Dr. Mahoney's point to a certain extent, I don't think it's a coincidence that the ascendance of like a sort of Nietzschean right-wing politics is obtaining at the same moment that, Generation Z, people younger than them, they're sort of they don't have a relationship with their grandparents or these sorts of institutions that I'm alluding to. So my question for the three of you, anyone here maybe, is how to make conservatism more appealing or more accessible to those groups, right?
Is your question in some way related to this? It is a little bit. Okay, why don't we take two questions, which we will then attempt to comment on.
Well, maybe communism was the last great optimistic ideology. I don't know, that they thought we could do something. In America, we used to be optimistic, but I think my daughters are your age, they're not optimistic anymore. We didn't know why we were optimistic, we just were. And could you guys, are you optimistic? Or are you pessimistic? And if you're optimistic, why? What's there to be optimistic about for the future?
Conservative wisdom is all about rejecting the categories of pessimism and optimism. If you look at things from a little bit from the perspective of eternity, you're not going to see even an authentic crisis. The West has been in crisis for a long time. It's not new. All the great conservative thinkers in the 40s and 50s were writing in a different context: mass society, deculturization, dechristianization, the rise of totalitarianism. They were writing about the culture of the West, the crisis of the West. I think the problem with pessimism is it freezes our capacity to act. The future is open-ended, and even if the present trends are troubling, and more than troubling. Eric Vogelin, who I'm quoting a lot tonight, he said, no one is obliged to be complicit in the ideological deformation of their age. In other words, we're not obliged to parrot this nonsense. We're not obliged to raise our students that way. We're not obliged to live on TikTok and Twitter. We're not obliged to be fearful. We might even exercise one of the cardinal virtues, courage. So when you look at things that way, I think the spectrum of optimism and pessimism is both to this worldly, and it's also it presupposes some kind of directionality to history, and there is no direction to history in the long run. So we've got to be human beings who do the right thing, who exercise the virtues, who defend what's best in our country, stand up to evil, oppose ideology when it rears its face, and you can have honor and a certain kind of spiritual peace even if you don't win. But I'm not saying we're going to lose. And there's solace in fighting the battle and standing up for civilization against its cultured despisers.
Well, let me just address your question. I think that's actually one of the themes that we wanted to discuss was, we do see values. There are significant, the value of the individual in liberalism is strongly emphasized, but sometimes at the expense of the human need for community, right? And family and these institutions. So one of the things I think we tried to emphasize was that, like Aristotle said, right, human beings are fundamentally social beings. And one of the perhaps effects of the social atomization you talked about is a kind of loneliness, a kind of feeling of being lost. So one of the things that I hope would be attractive to conservative values is the emphasis it places on communities, but not so much the coercive community of the state as getting into everything, but voluntary communities, marriages in the West, this was an important Christian principle, are entered into voluntarily, right? The family, religions, churches, and so forth. So, actually the unchurching of the youth that's happening in a lot of the West, I think may also be contributing to some of that sense of social atomization. So that's something I think conservatism should address. I would agree, to your question, I would agree with a lot of what Dan says about we can't be deterministic. This is something Roger Scruton talked about. You need to actually defend the good, the true, and the beautiful in the situation you are in. I think the Christian attitude is, we could say, historically realist, but eschatologically optimistic. That is, the universe is ultimately governed by a good God, and things will end for the good in the eschatological, transhistorical sense, but we can't be certain in what direction history would go. One other thought that I had about reasons to be optimistic is that the West, in its long tradition, going back to Homer, to the present, has so many riches of music, of art, of philosophy, of science, of moral conceptions and political conceptions. I don't believe that things that are truly excellent ever die entirely. They're always, I believe, rediscovered. No matter how much you might say, Mozart is some product of some oppressive. You listen to the third violin concerto and you hear greatness. So I would believe in that.
One point. What Alex said, I think about yes, ultimately any kind of optimism that's worthy of being acknowledged would be eschatological. But that also points to the fact Christian humanists don't believe the good is unsupported, that in the order of providence, there's support. And even understood more in a less theological way, the good has more grounding, more substance, more vitality than evil. As Simon Weil says, in literature and movies, the evil always looks dynamic and the good looks boring. But in real life, the good is dynamic and evil is awfully monotonous. And so you gotta hope, shy of that kind of Christian understanding. Horace, the Latin poet, Horace's great image. You can throw nature out the front window, but eventually she'll come back in the back door. And it's really hard to get rid of human nature. And that means in the end, all the ideological projects to replace the human condition or human nature with another world, these are literally manifestations of what Burke called metaphysical madness. That's encouraging.
So I would like to, one note, we've heard a very well-deserved jibe at the concept of rap culture this evening. Yeah. But there actually, when I was young, there's one line from the opening track on a rap album, which is actually quite good. The album, a British rapper called The Streets said, "I'm 45th generation Roman," which I think is actually not a bad line. That is culture. That is culture.
I find nothing wrong with that line.
But this is actually leading somewhere. So we've heard, and hopefully back to the second question as well. We've heard a number of times tonight, and in a sense, as we heard from Dr. Rosenthal, the whole book is an attempt to deal with what Roger Scruton called the culture of repudiation. And I'm wondering, we're leaving everyone with the idea of ancestral conservatism. That's a very strong concept to take forward. But I'm wondering whether we could also offer them some sort of answer to the culture of repudiation, which is that strong and that pithy and that memorable. And you actually, in one of your answers just a moment ago, Alex, you used the word which might be it, which relates to optimism, it relates to youth, and it relates to being 45th generation Roman, because, you know, part of the ancestral thing is that our ancestors were young too. Being young is part of ancestrality. Being young is part of the deal. And honoring those who were young before you is part of the deal. And Alexander, you used the word rejuvenation when you were talking about classics. And could we say that ancestral conservatism is trying to bring a culture of rejuvenation? Does that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, we could use rejuvenation, culture of affirmation also, you know, might be one, but yeah, I mean, one of the things that maybe also this relates to the optimism question is that both the classical and the Christian traditions of the West have proven themselves well over 2,000 years to be kind of evergreen, like sort of fonts that the West seems to sometimes move away from for a certain length of time, but return to again and again. This was a point, for example, made by Werner Jaeger, that most of the most creative periods of the West in terms of art and philosophy and so forth were periods where people were returning to Greece as sort of the arche, the origin point of European civilization. And I think the same can certainly be true of Christianity, right? I mean, if you were living at certain points, you know, in Rome of the Renaissance, where there's a lot of discussion of materialism and stuff like that. You wouldn't have imagined the Counter-Reformation, you know, these movements of rejuvenation. The Great Awakening would be an example in the American context. So I think these are sort of things of eternal value, which are evergreen fonts, and like the fountain of youth, right, is something that brings vitality back to traditions which have been treated with indifference, disrespect, forgotten, and so forth. So that's part of the hope.
So thanks to all of you for coming, and please join me in thanking our two wonderful speakers.